you for attending this rare opportunity to bring Welcoming America to Princeton for our local training. My name is Melissa Urias, and I am the Director of Princeton Human Services. Before we begin, I just want to address some housekeeping items. Our restrooms are down the hall to the right. Please help yourself to coffee and breakfast. Please silence your phones, and we will be recording this session, and it'll be shared on our website. I want to start off by thanking the Princeton Human Services Commission, Welcoming America, and the Princeton Civil Rights Commission for making this workshop opportunity possible. Thank you, Mayor and Council, for continuing to support our welcoming initiatives here in Princeton. In 2015, Princeton joined Welcoming America, becoming part of a global movement proactively working to build welcoming communities that value inclusiveness, unity, and diversity. To begin this program, we are pleased to have Elisa Neira, Deputy Commissioner of the New Jersey Department of Human Services, former Princeton Human Services Director, and former Welcoming America Spark Fellow, to deliver opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and good morning, everyone. It is so exciting. I can't tell you how thrilled I am to be here today to see some old faces of folks I used to work with while I was in Princeton. I had the opportunity to serve this community in the Princeton Human Services Director capacity for almost 5 years, and had the opportunity to also work on some of the welcoming initiatives here. So it's really exciting to be here today. I want to thank Melissa and the leadership of the Princeton Human Services Commission and the Civil Rights Commission for making and creating this space today to talk about this important topic, the importance of communication, messaging, at times where some members in our community are feeling fearful, are worried, and feel uncertain about their stand. Is this really, I can like talk really loud, and I'd rather do that because I think this is just, I'm like having a hard time with this mic, so.
Hello? Is that a little bit? Okay. I just want it to be like slightly amplified, not like, crazy. So, good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Molly. I work with a national organization called Welcoming America. We have been so honored to be working with the folks here in Princeton for a great many years, and I personally am super honored to be here today to share some work with you all, and just want to say again thank you so much to Letitia and Lisa and Melissa for all the work that they're doing. I think they really set the stage for sort of where we are. And the work that we all need to be doing in our communities, and really framing out some of the national and statewide policies that are really making it a little bit harder and a little bit more of a struggle for us to think about positively communicating the value of all of the residents in our communities and everyone who's there, and that there really are some, very organized and poignant things happening on the federal level that are diametrically opposed to the values that we want to share about our communities and the values that we bring to the table every day. So one of the things that I think we're going to talk about today that I think is sort of the most critical here is that really, like, when we are talking about communications and communication strategy, we are living in a time that is almost totally negative. And that negative rhetoric sort of really does seep into all of the work that we're doing on a daily basis. And sometimes the responses to that, and our own responses to that, are not entirely intuitive. Like, we want to respond one way, and research tells us that that's probably not the most effective way. And so that's really, I think, where we're going to sit today in some of the training and the conversations that we're going to have. So I'm just going to start right there and say, Welcoming America has been sort of thinking about this communication strategy, working with some researchers and some other folks for several years, and we don't think we have it all figured out, but we think we got a little piece. And so, and again, it's ever evolving, right? I think I was telling Melissa earlier, a few years ago, we were talking about immigrant integration and immigrant welcoming, and folks were like, "Oh, that's a really nice thing that you do over there. That's wonderful." And today, it's really become sort of this flashpoint in American politics, and it's a really different place to sit. And I think it changes our whole dynamic. So that being said, that's how I'm going to contextualize where we are today, and this is where we're where we're going to go. To be adhering to good form around adult learning. Here are some of our goals for today. I'm not going to read them all to you, but I hope that we can kind of walk away with some new perspectives, strategies, and basically also know that we've got some other co-conspirators in the room and in the community who can help carry this work forward. I sure will. Melissa already has those, so we can just go ahead and load them into the Eventbrite agenda for you all to have later on. So don't feel like you need to be furiously scratching down notes, because I will say that this PowerPoint in particular has a lot of slides. But we'll go through some of it pretty quickly. So I think most of the folks in this room are going to be here this afternoon also, I'm going to share just a little bit about Welcoming America, but like I said, I think This training is a little bit shorter than the one this afternoon. So if you guys have questions specifically about Welcoming America, the organization, all that, we can probably talk more about that this afternoon. But just so you all know, Welcoming America is a national organization. We work with about 200 communities across the country who are all doing welcoming work on some level. You know, our big idea is really that local communities have the power to change the narrative around immigration locally, and that kind of place-based work is really the only thing that we want to put our efforts and time into in the current sort of political landscape. So really, our work then is to connect, support, and provide resources for folks in their own communities, just like you, all over the country. So that's really it on its very most broad spectrum. We've been around for about 10 years, and I can talk a little bit later about how we sort of came up with the idea and kind of where we're going. The big thing here is that we are really trying to help communities move across a welcoming spectrum. And this means not just doing work in communities that already are really welcoming. Like, I think here in Princeton, you all are really welcoming already. And as far as policies and procedures, and in the state of New Jersey, I mean, all of the things that are happening under the Murphy administration, those were like, I'm like, yay, cheering, because, you know, I get to spend a lot of time in places like Iowa and Nebraska, and, you know, so things sometimes are a little bit more challenging there on the state level. So you all are really in a space that has a lot of great potential. But the thing that really we want to be able to do with this training is to say, hey, you know what? We're moving folks from fearful to tolerant to welcoming, and then on to the next level. But here's the thing, right? Like, you can say, like, wow, we as Princeton can be a national leader in all of this work, and I think you guys really are. But I think it's also really important that right now in this particular political landscape, that we really buckle down on those values, and that we say, you know what, like, we are not complacent, and that we understand while demographic change continues to happen in our communities and political rhetoric continues to ramp up, we really need to be remembering to share those values out, because as folks see their communities changing, as demographic change happens, as the political rhetoric deepens, it is easy for folks who aren't as deeply connected to the work, for those sorts of ambiguities and nervousness and apprehension to kind of rise back up. And I think that's the part that makes this work so necessary and so continue, and the need for such a continuation right now. So one of the ways in which Welcoming America and some of our partners and all of our member organizations have really thought about creating inclusive communities and focusing in on belonging is through something that we call the receiving communities approach. And so, you know, the receiving communities approach really means that if you want to talk about belonging and about inclusion and about immigrant integration, then we need to be talking to everyone in the community. We need to be talking to the folks who are impacted by specific policies around immigration, but we also need to be talking to folks from other communities who also may have felt, you know, left behind or left out of the current economic boom, for instance, or of other social infrastructure plans and community-based pieces. I think one of the things that we see really often is when we say receiving communities, there's an image that pops into people's heads that is a primarily old and white demographic. And in many of our communities, that's just not true. And I think one of the things that we've seen throughout the past 10 years is that when we more deeply engage all the demographics in our communities, then we can really see those positive community changes and feedback. So, who here is a gardener? One of the pieces here that we talk about is that if you're a gardener, you never just like take a plant, throw it in some rocky old soil, not water it, put it in the shade. Probably nothing will happen. Like you won't be able to grow a nice little nice little sprout. But if you add compost, if you ensure that soil is full of nutrients, then you can grow a healthy plant. And really the analogy there is that the newcomers in our community are much like those seeds, and the whole community is much like that nutrient-rich soil. And that when you put those two things together, you can really create a beautiful garden or a beautiful orchard or whatever you would like to call it. And on the sort of broader spectrum of that, you can really create a community where everyone has the opportunity to contribute and thrive socially, economically, civically, and politically if they are so inclined. But that really focusing on all of that piece is a critical juncture. I mentioned this before, but receiving communities are very diverse. And when we think about the impact that we really want to make in our communities, it really depends on what your own local demographics look like, right? And like where do we go from there? So I think we kind of talked about this before. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So how exactly do we work? How exactly do we make this model, operationalize in communities for community change? One of the first pieces that we really talk about in Welcoming America within our network and within all of the other work that we do is this piece about contact. Very, very often, people in communities don't have meaningful contact with each other or with folks from other demographics, and especially across lines of language and ethnicity. And finding ways to bring newcomers and immigrants, refugees, and other long-term residents together can be really, really powerful. Welcoming America has been really deeply thinking about contact theory and how that fits into the larger landscape of social psychology and how we really put all that together. And there are some components to that I think are really critical, and because we're not necessarily just talking about a potluck, right? Like a potluck is like a great place to start, and when you think about let's get some people in the room together. But a couple of the components that I really like to think about when I'm thinking about contact building and contact building theory is really this piece about getting people on a level playing field. Like one person is not the receiver of services and another person is not the giver of services, right? Like it's like this, I mean, it's not rocket science, but it's like one of the hardest things for us to do in our communities. And it really, and we'll talk more about what some examples of that are. And another one is around shared goals. Right, to have something you're working for together, an outcome that you want to see to better the community for everyone. And those are two of the big pieces there. Another one is really about leadership. And I think you all here are incredibly, I'm not going to say lucky, but just that the municipal government here, the state government, there's a lot of folks also fighting for these policies and changes. And I think that really can amplify the work that you all are doing. What we've seen, and one of the things that I know from my own work, is that if you have a population of folks in your community who are largely ambivalent about a particular issue, and there's somebody, either a formal leader or informal leader, who speaks, really negatively or really positively about whatever issue it is, they can really bring people along in their communities. And I think we don't give quite enough credit to that sometimes. And again, this is also a piece. Who are the spokespeople for your issue, right? Who are the people that are trusted in your communities? Who are the ones that folks say, hey, what do you think about this initiative or this, or permit parking? Or whatever, right? Like taking leadership in those spaces, I think could be. We have a lot of examples of that leadership, but also knowing that, especially when it comes to an issue like immigration or other kinds of diversity initiatives, like having leaders that really are taking the time to share the message of positivity around those initiatives, I think can really, really bring folks along. I work in a small community in Minnesota, and I think I'll talk a little bit about them later. They are the home of Hormel. They host the Spam Museum. And they're a community that has experienced really high rates of demographic change over the past 30 years, and they were working on some of their welcoming work there. And my friend Jason, who is on the city council and has done a lot of work, he always says that progress moves at the speed of relationships. And one of the things that he's done throughout his work in trying to be a good advocate for folks in his community is he uses his own platforms. He goes to Rotary, he goes to these other professional places, and he really shares the message about the values of the community as far as welcoming, and the work that he personally is doing to ensure that happens. And I think, because of the rooms that he is able to get into, he's really been able to broaden the scope and the commitment of folks in that space. And then the third one is about communications, and we're going to get into all that in just a couple of minutes. But the basis here is around the messages that we are all told about newcomers to our communities. And largely, they are misinformed. They are a rhetoric of one of taking, one of needing, and it's really factually not true. But also, we fail to come up with the right alternatives that can humanize folks and that can connect, that can help us connect on a deeper level. And so that's really the piece that we're going to be delving a lot more into today. But that's sort of our model around leadership, contact, and communication. So I'm going to stop really briefly right there because I think if there's any questions that folks have sort of about that three-tiered model, we can pause quickly and jump into that. Otherwise, we're going to talk a little bit. We're going to really get into the meat of the communications piece. And I'm going to. No? Yes.
I actually, just because recently I heard that in New York, especially now that they've going to expand driver's licenses.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, they're being targeted for which program is that? Where you can global entry.
Oh,
Global entry. But I know they're not doing the states.
yes.
So my concern is in communities where we are are one community, we look out for each other?
That is a really great question, and just in case you guys didn't hear it, it's really about what can communities do to keep spreading the message of welcome, but also not make themselves targets for a larger federal landscape that doesn't really like to see welcoming policies, I guess would be the we've had communities do this in a couple of different ways, right? Many communities in the Midwest, I will say, have been really, really low profile about their welcoming work. Like they're saying, we're not going to put a press release out about the fact that we are doing municipal IDs, for instance. We're not going to put a press release out about all of our work around the census. We're actually not going to pass a welcoming resolution in our city council. We're going to have like an internal policy decision, and we're gonna go from there. So that's one way. The other way, I think, is to know that I think, you know, we have the backing of the courts on the basis of inclusion in this country, and we still have that. And I, for one, am not quite ready to lose faith in that piece of it too, and that, you know, we can continue to work very closely with law enforcement and with our local electeds to really figure out what are the municipal policies and ways that we can continue to protect the residents of our communities while also advocating on the larger scale. But there's not a real good blueprint for that yet, right? I mean, you know, and currently we are seeing it mostly happen through the courts. Yeah. There's also another thing that we could do, I suppose. Vote. All right. Oh, yes. I think, yeah, building that multi-sector and multi-ethnic approach to all of this is really, you know, the operationalizing key. And I think the piece about municipal or county IDs is really, really important. That, like, if you live in a community that has that option, and you are not an immigrant, like, you should get that ID and you should use it. Right, like we need to normalize these kinds of identification programs too.
Actually, on that note, I wanted to add, I understand that in Washington State, he's already issuing the Real ID compliance, that many communities have chosen, even though they qualify for it, to not get it in solidarity with their neighbors who can't. So, because if they have a passport, they can always use their passport to travel.
Right.
But with the Real ID, it identifies who is a citizen and who may not be.
Yeah.
So it's similar to us who get the community ID, even though we may have a driver's license.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have a quick question. You're making more for I'm not sure. You talked about Midwest, and I was curious if there were posters available that could be placed to let people know what services they can safely apply for, that would not put them in jeopardy as a public park. Do such posters exist?
So there are some national organizations. I think probably the biggest one is the Titanium Families Network. They are, it's a combination of class and
I would say, yeah, I was going to say NILC is probably, yeah, the National Immigration Law Center. They usually have some fact sheets, but I haven't seen anything that's like, print this out and stick it in your bathroom, kind of a. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think that that's one of the things that I think that's happening with a lot of the federal policy landscape is that things just are moving really, really quickly, and then yeah, they'll stop and start within the court system, and like how do we as providers and community advocates, one, sort of keep up with all of that, and then again be able to feel like we're able to communicate that effectively. I think at Welcoming America, like that's something that we're really trying to like distill for our members within like the space of our own, you know, like putting out some rapid response pieces or like referring folks to to Families Belong Together, to NILC, to all of these other resources, because again, like it is moving really, 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 really quickly. So demographics in the country are changing. Like this is not a surprise. I don't think to anyone here. And it sounds like here in Princeton, the number of foreign-born population or immigrant populations is significantly higher than it is nationally. You guys said 22%. New Jersey is 22%. Yeah. But nationally, that demographic change is around 14% and growing. I was recently in Wichita, Kansas, actually, and Wichita, Kansas is demographically exactly representative of the country, which is super crazy. They have a 14% foreign-born population. They have a 26% African American population or Black population, and then they have like this all of these other sort of really interesting sort of demographic things. And I was like, it was a very interesting case study in demographic shifts there in Wichita. But really the piece here is that whether communities are optimistic about demographic change and excited about what new diversity and vibrancy can bring to their communities, or they're really apprehensive, like this change is happening. And so, you know, being able to talk about it and you know, bring the receiving community into the fold is really super important. And we're running, and in some ways we are going to run out of time on that. One of the things I think that is kind of the value base here is that as our communities get more diverse, some members of our communities start to feel like they belong less. And we all have this very core need for belonging. And this is sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs of belonging, as opposed to the needs of food and shelter and other pieces. But I think you know, this hierarchy is usually portrayed as a pyramid, as you guys can see here. But I think the need for kind of like love and belonging really lie kind of in that middle space, and that's where a lot of the core work that we want to do in our communities really sits, right? Like we're not necessarily always appealing to folks on a super theoretical level, on a super brain capacity level, and I think when we're talking about communications, that's why we run into problems when we start overwhelming people with the facts. And so I think just, this is kind of where we're kind of rooting these kinds of spaces. Another way to really think about this is that when we don't fulfill the needs of belonging in our community, that's when our community really starts to lack what we call social cohesion. And social cohesion is really the capacity of a society to ensure the well-being of its members by creating a sense of belonging, promoting trust, and working to eliminate disparities and promote equity. And this really also includes kind of avoiding exclusion and marginalization. And I think that's one of the spaces where there is a lot of emerging research, but there's not fully formed concepts on how to exactly build social cohesion in your community. But we do know that that what we're really trying to do is strengthen ties and move people beyond some inequities. And these are really the two dimensions that we're working across here. So one of the things that we see happening all the time is that we have sort of these increased interactions through social media and through other forms of communication, I guess. But we're really struggling to see how that fits within our need for belonging. The challenge of systemic inequities and all of those other things really limit our ability to kind of get outside of our echo chambers, especially in these spaces. And so when we're thinking about our community-wide work, it's really important, I think, for us to just remember that we're getting all of these bits of news and of sound bites and of our friends telling us this and that and the other thing, and it's hard to know that there might be other people that are living in almost an entirely parallel universe as far as the amount of information that they're receiving. How many of you all made yourself some resolution about news or social media this year? Yeah. Like where do we consume our news from? Who do we get it from? I think it's a conversation that we all are having with ourselves constantly, right? The other piece about this, and I think the most of the research around this has really been done on teenagers and how they are so much more connected on social media, but yet they feel so much more isolated in life. And I'm assuming that many of us feel that way a little bit too, but I don't think they've done quite as much research on us older folks. But really, I think it does impact our day to day on a number of different levels. How many of you all remember there was this book when I was in college, and it was called Bowling Alone? And it was like the premier book on social isolation. It was by a guy named Robert Putnam. And it was all about how more and more people, there were statistics that more and more people were bowling, but there were less and less bowling leagues. And they used this as really sort of the analogy that we are all that we are pulling back from social and civic engagement. And I think one of the things that we have seen over the past 20 years is that's true, and we see that in decline in all of our sort of social and civic institutional groups. I'm talking Rotary, Kiwanis, Lions, all of those kinds of spaces that were really in many ways the bedrocks of social infrastructure in our communities. But so if we're thinking about ourselves in this space, there's just a ton of research that really shows that like a lot of folks are really feeling this way, and specifically. This is what sort of gave rise to the Make America Great Again movement in many ways. That folks were feeling really isolated. They were feeling really nostalgic for a time that they felt like there were more people were more neighborly. They knew their communities. You know, you've got all of these sort of old school images of what that used to look like and again, I mean, obviously it's a hugely problematic narrative on a number of different levels, and for, you know, almost all parts of the population of this country, but I think that nostalgia has really resonated. And there's a bunch of, again, you know, I don't know that I need to tell you guys this, but there's just a lot of research that's coming out of there, that's coming out about this kind of social isolation piece, and that, you know, that has an impact on the way that we see newcomers in our communities, and some of the rhetoric that happens. You know, for instance, you know, we've got these ideals of like the melting pot, or the American dream, or the American generosity of spirit, and these are all things that really do continue to resonate in our communities on some level. However, they're not necessarily translating up in the way that is critical for social change and social policy. For instance, one of the pieces that the Democracy Fund Voice talks about here is that many Americans surveyed expressed positive views about immigrants and newcomers' work ethic, but have concerns that folks are not learning English, or they're not integrating appropriately or efficiently. One of the things I have seen a lot in Detroit, for instance, is that, you know, there's a huge Muslim community there, and one of the pieces that people say all the time is, to me, is that there is an assumption that if you are a practicing Muslim woman and that you wear a headscarf, that you are not integrating, and like that's just like a full, like that's an assumption that people have, and it's completely untrue. But yet it, yeah. Mm. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. The best advice, but it's not usually possible in many places, is like a fully bilingual school, right? Like my nephews and nieces in Colorado go to a fully bilingual public school. 70% of the kids who go there are native Spanish speakers, speak Spanish at home, and it is literally one day Spanish, one day English, one day Spanish, one day English. And so my nieces and nephews have learned Spanish through that process, and the native Spanish speaking kids are learning English right there. Nobody's separate in their classes. Like, it just is what it is. And I think, you know, that's a really innovative model, but I do know that there are lots of other programs, and we'll talk more about this afternoon, really, of, you know, peer mentoring and ways that you can still create those connections between students, even if they do have to do some separation for class and language learning. And, you know, I think as we sort of think about what the plurality of language looks like in our country, I'm going to finish this thought really quickly. You know, more and more communities are thinking about the ways in which they're integrating other languages too. I mean, I know that there are places in New York City, for instance, where they're thinking about, like, oh, you know what, we need to have traffic court in Spanish because everyone coming here is a native Spanish speaker. And so, you know, that, like, instead of having 7 interpreters come, we can just do things in that way. And then the other. Mm. Mm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, yep. Got it. Mm-hmm. I think that there are some, yeah, those kind of like peer connection and peer mentoring programs, some kinds of club systems. I think also really, I think there's some really intentional teacher curriculums and some of that leadership component too, I think is really key in there. I mean, I think you can talk, you know, we can talk all day about how kids don't bring their biases to the table until we help them along with that space. But I think we are living in a particular context where being really intentional about the way that we help folks create connections is of the utmost importance. And, you know, I think there are great resources out there for teachers and for other educators. But again, I think if it's a piece that you're really concerned about in your school, the leadership of the school needs to really get on board with that too.
Yeah, there are some educators here, we have school principals here, and and some other educators. And I think, to answer your question, I think some of it is, you know, I think there are sort of the peer mentoring days, there are sort of the things that you can do to bring kids together into a classroom, whether it's, you know, try to figure out what the common ground is and sort of take that to things. But I think we also have to recognize that there are sometimes systematic and structural things that are actually keeping kids apart, right? Because we sometimes are not fully understanding the different communities that we serve, but what are some of their challenges, right? I think language is one of them, but economic factors are also another, right? And so I think as a school and as leaders in the school and as educators and as a community, we all have a role to play in sort of recognizing what those things are and starting to chipping away at those systematic things and those structures that exist that naturally it's going to make it hard for everyone
Right.
to feel fully integrated.
And where are the places outside of school that we can also be helping folks make those connections beyond the kids and within their families? And I think, like YMCA, I think does a really great job with some of those kinds of pieces. I think you had one other question. Yeah, okay, yeah. So I think really the bottom line was how are we creating opportunities within schools, specifically for diverse populations, to bridge boundaries, to create connections, to kind of be in this, social, just create those social bonds, right? Because I think it's all fine and good for us to talk about like what we need to do as adults, but again, we can have some more hope. And some of that has to do with language. Some of it has to do with structural and systemic differences and needs, but also the will, too. And I think later on this afternoon, we'll talk a lot more about schools and community engagement and family engagement and all of those kinds of pieces too. Oh, sure, yes. That's a great idea. All right, we'll take one more here and then we'll jump back in.
If you're just looking for general comments, I have a loud voice on the screen. As a school leader, we're with a charter school with administrators here, something that we're trying to continually work on. We have seen hiring for diversity is an important need. Looking at our curriculum so that diversity is reflected in our curriculum and what students are seeing. Looking at how we can show the value of diversity in our walls and halls. So we're looking through acknowledgement of African American History Month, the Latinx students, having images on the walls of student projects that are geared towards those, and also faculty training. So we're trying to dedicate, and we have been trying to dedicate time to help our staff in terms of training from outside experts. So those are some of the pieces. I do think that the diversification of staff is probably the most important for us is going to be attractive in this, and also using our families. So we've had we have a large Asian population, so we've had a lunar celebration that our families have organized. And we have an incredibly diverse population in a lot of ways. We have international. We're going to have our third international night where families are from all different countries. Food is a great way to connect. So
It is. Great. Well, thank you. And yeah, this afternoon, for those of you who are able, we really the whole piece is around schools, and I think it's really a time for us to kind of dig deep into some of those pieces. I think we're gonna shift gears just a little bit here and really start to dig into this sort of communications and message framing. So I have a couple of questions for you all to just sort of start pondering as we kind of jump into this piece. And the first one is, and maybe we'll just take a couple of quick reflections from the group. And what do you read, hear, or see in the media now about immigrants?
Immigrants are taking our jobs away.
Let's say it.
I'm done.
Good. He said, whoa, that's really loud. Okay. Immigrants are taking our jobs away. Anything? Using healthcare. Okay. Yeah.
I think that there's another story too, and that that certain aspects of media are sharing that immigrants are bringing a wonderful special perspective, and that as we highlight those stories, we'll see that it's important, not just to welcome, but they bring a very special aspect that have even saved communities, and so I think to me it's important to focus in on those special examples to counteract the negative that we will often see in the media.
Right. Absolutely.
What we normally see, the bigger picture in the media tries to sell their delivery, right? And what sells the delivery is the negative images that they put out there. I mean, even in your comment about, what make America great again means, and for those that are old enough in the room to remember the Ozzie and Harriet generation, all right, it didn't include any people of color, all right. The immigrant population was limited to those that came, from Europe, all right. And that's kind of the way the media still spins it. They'd rather create these negative images and perpetuate that because that sells newspapers.
Yeah. All right. How can positive communications really help us get to where to share the message that we want to see in our communities, right? The vibrancy, the shared values, all of those kinds of pieces, because I think we can all acknowledge, I think, on some level that in general the narrative has been fairly negative. And because that dominant narrative has been so negative, we really need to start at a pretty basic and ground level. I think some of the pieces on this too are who are we trying to reach, right? Really, who are the folks that are along that spectrum and that continuum. And so I think one of the things that we're doing is that if we clarify who we want to reach, how we speak to them, and through what channels we can be more effective spokespeople. We can be the people who are sharing that narrative. Like, we don't have to wait necessarily for CNN to decide to change their mind on that. Like, we can do that. But I think knowing that our communications is really part of building a welcoming community and not really sort of adjacent to all of the other work that we're doing is really a key thing to kind of to remember in this space. Yeah. There is a very loud voice that's negative. Well, on the national level, we are also developing champions as well. And I think we can say that we are we're part of a growing movement of folks who are on some level saying, like, enough is enough, right? And that this is not the reality of what's happening in our communities, and we directly resist this sort of conversation or framing.
I think it's important to recognize that the media also contributes to exposing the damage that's done, what's happening in detention.
Yes.
And that's really important to make people aware.
The problem is the media that we listen to is all the same media. And the media that needs to reach these other folks better be the other.
I understand that, but I think that
No, I agree. And I'm not, I mean, and I don't think that this training is really trying to say that we shouldn't trust the media or that we shouldn't prop up media or that we don't rely heavily on sources of news in our community. I think one of the things that we see more and more is that, yes, we all consume our media from different places, and that, you know, one of the things that I saw very clearly, someone was talking about during this impeachment trial, for instance, compared to the Nixon's impeachment trial, was that there were 3 news sources back then. Like, you could be pretty much aware that most of the people that had information about the impeachment had gotten their news from one of 3 sources: NBC, CBS, or ABC. And that's just not the space that we're living in. And I think you're absolutely right that media still does play a super critical role in exposing the crisis at the border, what's happening when travel bans get rolled out and folks get stuck in airports. Like, I think telling that story is also critically important. And so I think you know, where we find ourselves then is really, how do we both filter that media as well as have critical conversations when it is something that doesn't line up with our values or isn't exposing a specific truth for us. Yes.
Rightfully so, as it relates to media and helping children understand different forms of media literacy, and even more so, intentionally teaching the competency of communication, especially across lines of difference.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, whether it's from things like programs of speech and debate or ethics studies and other things, but at the earliest age, and I mean, you know, early childhood or kindergarten, being intentional about this competency of communication. If we're going to take the long view on any of this, we're not seeing role models as adults. And so we really need to be intentional with our children to foster that type of skill. You know, we see it in the school setting. If you're not doing it in the schools, then we're really delinquent in that regard. So.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think I'm going to move through this a little bit more quickly, but I think one of the pieces that you really brought up here, and that I think we want to really focus on when we're thinking about this, is that there really is a lot of nuance here, and that we ourselves are just trying to figure out how to sort through that, and how and what we do with all of those images that are coming at us really quickly, and what do we. And how do we better communicate our values through our own opportunities to share media, as well as how do we continue to support media that does share our values, and what does that look like, right? And I think one of the things that we some of the assumptions that we make through that space is really around confirmation bias, right? Like, oh, I'm hearing all of this stuff, but I really need to go and do my own research. Guess what? Google already knows what we think. So the first article, of course, supports our idea, and I think that's the piece. Oh, I've got it totally figured out, and we know that that confirmation bias really does end up to be this fight between our heart and our brain, and we are really thinking like, oh, I am doing my due diligence, like I'm going to get to the bottom of this. But again, we spend a lot of time and heartaches kind of thinking about that, and it really is and honestly, like, our brains and our hearts really interact in very complicated ways when it comes to contentious issues especially. And I think immigration has become one of those very contentious issues in our society. And really, you know, the thing is that we really hold, maybe not everyone in this specific room, but in general, as a population of folks in this country, we hold a lot of conflicting and emotional views around immigration. And I think that is something that we continue to see through polling. We continue to see it through some of the deep canvassing work that's happening, which is a really new piece in trying to sort of shift the narrative. But that, you know, this is very complex. It's not as black and white as sometimes it appears to be, you know. And when we're really talking about framing, we're talking about what is going to resonate on an emotional level. We have to move past some of the facts, and how do we think about these spaces where we have these very complex and conflicting views, right? I think these are like really diametrically opposed images that lots and lots of people in this country feel both ways about, for instance. And so I think it really does kind of makes our job difficult in many of these ways. You know, we think about how to communicate about immigrants in our community, and I think it's important to, you know, recognize that it's not unusual for folks to have a colleague or a dear friend or someone, and they know their immigrant background, but they also feel really like, wow, like there are things happening at the border that I'm uncomfortable with, that there's a lot of chaos surrounding our asylum process, that, you know, newcomers and immigrants, you know, may be good for certain parts of the economy and bad for other parts of the economy, or all of these other kinds of things. And that, like, we have to get really creative and start thinking about the ways in which we prepare ourselves to address these kinds of views. And so I think, you know, what are our rules of the road? Like, who are we trying to reach? Where are we trying to get them to? And how do we change that narrative in our community? And I think this is kind of an interesting space to look at, right? So know your audience, and your audience isn't you. And you know, I mean, I think for all of us in this room, we could probably think about the one person maybe that we think, like, okay, there's one person that I know that I'm going to sort of think about in the next couple of sections, like where maybe I could move them a little bit, you know. But for instance, there's a piece and a narrative and a story that sort of that says, you know, like that nation of immigrants image, right? Like that is a story that resonates really well with some folks, or with, you know, myself, who, you know, grew up in a very Hispanic neighborhood, Latinx neighborhood in Colorado, and was really surrounded by wonderful, wonderful folks coming and going from Mexico all the time. And like, I really, you know, strongly related to the values, and I loved, you know, the culture and the food and learning the language from their parents, and like all of those kinds of things. But this sort of nation of immigrants concept, for instance, doesn't always resonate with folks from the Native community, for instance, right? Or folks from African American or Black communities who are here in this country as part of forced migration and slavery, right? There's a lot of broader strokes to this piece, and we have seen the Nation of Immigrants one as sort of probably the most propped up positive spin that we've seen, and we were like, oh, why isn't that working, you know? And so I think there's a lot of ways to do that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think really what you're speaking to that really gets to the heart of much of this is that very few of us know a complete history, right? And I think when we're talking about immigration or about segregation, and all of these historical contexts, we can take it all the way back to, you know, concepts of how, you know, manifest destiny is rooted in white supremacy. I mean, like, we can go way back, right? Like there's a lot of stuff here, and we carry a lot of stuff as a nation that really kind of complicates all of this. And I think that's, again, I think it's just a really great thing to remember, that when you know, what we're talking about here in just a minute is really about, like, who is our audience? You know, what are our shared values? And I think it's becoming a little bit more difficult to really root out and get to the bottom of what are those shared values exactly? And are there shared values in Princeton that are significantly different than shared values in Detroit? Are there, you know, shared values in, you know, Nebraska that, you know, certainly don't resonate in New York City? And so I think really thinking about those kinds of pieces is where we are. I'm afraid I'm going to have to just kind of keep going. Shared. Well, we hope so. I think one of the things that when we're really thinking about who are we talking to in the space of our own communications and within all of our own strategies around welcoming work, and, you know, and I guess I don't know exactly, for folks that work with kids in this room, if some of these numbers sort of shake out in the same way, or where, you know, I've been thinking a lot, like, I have a second grader, and thinking about sort of what kind of dynamics are happening in his classroom around some of these issues, and how and how, you know, teachers at his school are approaching some of the things that kids are bringing into the classroom, and how that works. But I think we know pretty statistically there's sound statistical information saying that about 20% of the folks in our country are, we can be assured, are with us, right? Like they are feeling, well, about 20% of the folks are at either end of the spectrum. let's just go there. So we have folks who feel very positively about the contributions of newcomers and immigration in total, for instance, and then we have folks who feel really, really strongly that immigration should be, very much controlled and or changed in our country. But we also have a vast amount of folks in the middle who really don't really know what they think about this issue. And I know that sounds super crazy when I say it out loud, but like it's just an issue I think that even still much of the general population isn't really spending as much time on. And now we may see that really shift over the next, few months. And we have seen it shift a little bit. Okay. I think ambivalence is potentially acceptance. These are the folks that we're talking about that may hold those conflicting views, for instance, right? Like, I really like using my brother-in-law as an example here. He is a superintendent for a commercial construction company in Madison, Wisconsin. And he works with a very large number of immigrants, and he absolutely values the work ethic and the relationships that he has with the guys on his team, right? But yet he still says, oh, we definitely need a wall. Like, all right, Tom, like, I don't know. So I think that's where we're talking about right there, right? How do we move folks from like individual relationships? And I think this is the same thing that happens in lots of levels of diversity and equity training as well. How are we moving folks from individual action, individual relationships, to collective action, to community action, to policy change? Yes, ma'am. Oh, you did, yes. Yes.
I really appreciate your question and Molly, how you responded. That makes me think that to me that doesn't sound like ambivalence at all. That sounds like two very firmly entrenched opinions.
I think the ambivalence comes in trying to reconcile those, right? And where can we move folks? I'm going to skip this one. So if we're leading, if we're talking about shared values, right? And we're trying to lead with a unifying message, I think that's a great example. We can sort of let's keep that in our brain. Like, okay, we need to build a wall, but okay, like I need all these guys on my construction team to build this school. So where's the relevance? Where's the middle ground? And I think one of the maybe one of these next slides will kind of pull that out, and maybe it won't. But here's the way some communities have kind of gone about this. And so in North Carolina, they did this campaign around, and the value was really around community, right? Like we all are here in this community, and we all have a role to play. We'll get there together. The future of North Carolina, and it's also future oriented, right? To get us where we need to be, we'll get there together. This one is from Welcoming, Tennessee. It's a little bit older than some of the other ones, but this one is really around faith and family. Yeah. Yeah, these were all parts of like communications campaigns that that cities and communities have sort of undertaken over the years to kind of root out some of those ambivalence and really sort of elevate the conversation around welcoming. And you know, a couple of them are a few years old. But yeah, and so I think what you'll see, like I said, is that things that resonate in Tennessee might not be the same things that would resonate here. And so I think maybe thinking about what might be the things that would resonate here could be really helpful. Like for instance, you know, in Tennessee, faith is a really important part of the social cultural piece there. They consider themselves to be the buckle of the Bible Belt, I suppose, is kind of how they say that. And so talking about faith and a commitment to children and family is a way to sort of draw in those folks who may be feeling apprehensive about the demographic change in their community. We talked a little bit about Michigan. And Michigan really values pragmatism. You know, we're kind of a bootstrappy sort of place. So everybody works hard. I know that there's a lot of problematic narratives around bootstrapping too. So, but I think when we're talking about marketing, we really think about things in a little bit of a different way. But the other piece here is like hello neighbor, neighborliness, the core piece of, do you have someone in your community that you can rely on that lives next to you, right? Like, what does it mean to be a neighbor, and how do we create those kinds of dynamics and connections in our community? This one is from Nebraska and Colorado, and this is a really kind of interesting one here. I assume that, you know, there's probably not any Huskers fans in this group, but growing up in Colorado, like, I knew that, like, if you lived in Nebraska, like, football was the thing that you cared a lot about, and so just another great Nebraska fan. You know, coming together. Is sports a thing that brings people together here? Yeah, I don't know. I know, that's why I'm saying, like, that's what I'm saying. Like, I don't know if it's a thing, if it can really be the thing. I've been doing a lot of work in Kansas City, and boy, oh boy, problematic narratives all over the place with sports, but yet super, super, super bringing everyone together. It's been very, very interesting to see how that one goes. You know what? This is one of the newest kind of communications campaigns that has happened through some of this welcoming work, and this one is from Decatur, Georgia, and it really is this piece about connectivity. And this was a social media campaign that the folks doing the welcoming work there really honed in on, and all of the folks in this campaign, or these images, are all immigrant entrepreneurs in their community. So their goal was really twofold: to say, you know what, we are going to spend time sharing not just the images of newcomers in our community, but we also really want to highlight their businesses so that people go there and that they can get some real economic benefit from that. And I think this one has been it's been really cool to see, because they also worked with a bunch of different municipalities in the Atlanta area. And so you had folks from other municipalities actually promoting businesses in another municipality, which took a lot of really interesting collaboration. But I think, again, I think this is that kind of connectivity piece, and that we're all in this together in one way or another, is something that I think probably resonates a little bit more strongly currently than some of the other campaigns from before. So I don't know if you all would feel like that one might be a value that folks here could grab onto as well. But if you want to check that one out, you can look at the One Region Facebook page a little bit more. I don't want to read. I'm not fully going to read these, but I think, you know, another piece that we use within kind of the framing and in this communications piece is really around the competitive edge, and that's why I gave you guys the Welcoming Economies Playbook, which is another a piece about inclusive economic development that I brought. And this is a value and a marketing strategy, I guess, communication strategy that has resonated really succinctly and really well in many of the former industrial cities in the Rust Belt and in the Midwest. I think Detroit is a really great example. Pittsburgh is also a really great example of sort of talking about not just the not just the people as commodities, immigrant economic value or impact, but really talking about the competitive edge that your community has when it embraces, fosters, and promotes a diverse population of folks who can all contribute. All right. I think folks are getting a little restless here. All right. Interconnectedness. Here's another value and frame that I think is really key. You know, I think together we can reimagine what it means to be connected is really a space where I like to think about how we consider strategy in our work. Right, and I think that, and it really harkens back to what I was talking about at the very beginning of this around getting people together, and what is that new meaning of connectedness look like for our communities that are in this digital age, and where we are and where are we headed in that space. And again here, this one is really like America needs all of us, and that's the another sort of tool that we have here, and that is really that if we are going to confront the population challenges that we have, the workforce challenges that we have, all of the other pieces in our communities that work to bind us together, then we really need to think about the ways in which we are connected to each other on a really deep level. This also is a really piece about how do we protect our pluralistic democracy, and how do we make space for belonging and cohesion within a broad spectrum of diverse communities, and how do we engage long-term Latinx communities in this work around connected communities? How do we engage African American and Black communities? How do we engage very high-skilled foreign-born folks who are coming to work in our communities, and how do we engage newcomers who might be undocumented or at the kind of bottom of our socioeconomic standpoint, and where do we fit all of those pieces in our communities, and how do we share that message? Again, like cohesive communities look to each other to solve problems in their work, and it really does take all of us. One of the things that we really know is that we cannot fight fear with facts. Like, it is very easy for me to say, wow, you know what? In my small community of La Crosse, Wisconsin, I can tell you that foreign-born folks, especially in the medical field, have contributed, $17 million to the city budget or whatever. But again, okay, that doesn't necessarily make the case here. because I think really the piece is that like emotions always win, and that we really have to figure out ways that we can balance these values with stories and facts. I'm gonna bust through these real quick because I think there's a lot, but these are really around finding great spokespeople. Again, these are a couple of other campaigns that folks have run in their communities, and it's we do have some great statistics and stories about immigrant entrepreneurs that can be really helpful depending on where you sit in that space as well. The other piece is that we really know that collaboration between many groups and others within our communities is really the best way to share all of those values. And it's really hard, I guess, to stay within our echo chambers if we're really building multi-sector, multiracial, and multi-departmental and or community wide spaces to have and do this work. The other piece, and I think that is really important, and when you're thinking strategy-wise, is that we don't need to reinforce messages. We really need to replace these messages. Research really tells us that if we are saying don't blame immigrants for this, the exact opposite is going to happen. So if, for instance, there's a narrative around, well, my healthcare costs have really gone up, I need to blame folks who show up at the hospital that don't have insurance and are undocumented. Like, it would not be our best response to that is not immigrants are not taking your healthcare. The best response to that is, wow, healthcare has gotten really expensive. What can we do together to sort of solve those problems, right? And I think that's just a pretty quick example. I think one of the things you were talking about before about myth busting is an important piece of what we can do in this space, and can really counter the narrative, especially when you're talking about the statistics that we are seeing and the federal policy that's coming down the pike too, and really trying to create a narrative that is one of opportunity and one of we're investing in folks to create a better New Jersey for everyone, and not like, oh, human services and social services does this, and this for people in our community who don't have a lot of money or whatever. So I think, again, that kind of reframing too is really key. I think the other piece here is that we really need to use abundance thinking, right? Like, we cannot rely on this sort of me having a slice of pie doesn't mean there's less pie for you kind of thinking when we're talking about immigrants, when we're talking about other folks in our communities. And I think that can be a hard place these are complicated narratives to try to explain, and they don't come across in sound bites very well. And this one in particular, I think, is really hard, which is why I like the pie analogy. But again, I think if we're really thinking about how do we communicate in our communities, one of the other piece that really, I think, resonates with me is a long time ago I ran an AmeriCorps program, and the folks that were doing that AmeriCorps program were actually eligible for SNAP benefits because they got a very small stipend per month, and they were really unwilling to apply for those benefits because they thought that they would be taking away from someone who needed them more. And so a great example of that is saying, you know what, this is a federal program and that folks get these benefits if they need them, not that it's like, you know, you receiving these as an AmeriCorps member takes them away from a child in poverty, for instance. So I think, you know, in sort of thinking about things from a different perspective, that can be a great way. The other piece here is that we really cannot and should not shy away from talking about the places in which race and racism intersect with anti-immigrant sentiment. And this is a really tricky space to be in, and a place that we have a lot of conversations about, because I know that some of anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim sentiment is deeply rooted in racism. And again, all of the historical contexts of our country, and there's some folks at the Kellogg Foundation who are doing like reconciliation work, and some other folks who are really out on the forefront of what it means to be having those really kinds of in-depth conversations in our communities. But I think, you know, how do we really take those pieces of belonging and meld them in together into all of this work, while also not forgoing the fact that folks with language barriers are also confronting some other challenges in their communities. And I think that can be a really, you know, again, it's a piece that we can't discount here. Let's see, I'm going to skip some of these pieces, but what's our time? We have 5 minutes. 5 minutes, and I wanted to do a quick thing. But like I said, there was a lot of pieces. There's a lot of pieces here. And so, you know, one of the things that we see all of the time, I'm going to just send this with you all, and you can think about it later, is that we have all of the tools that we need to communicate effectively with the populations of folks that we are with every day. Whether that looks like a coordinated campaign that the folks doing welcoming work want to take on, whether that's something that you want to do within your particular institution to say, you know what, we really want to move beyond what we're doing right now, or whether it's within the personal spaces and the interpersonal communications that we have on a daily basis. There are lots of different kinds of frames that we can use to better tell the story of newcomers in our communities, and to better understand where folks who have conflicting views might be coming from. And I think that while we can look at lots of these pieces as really diametric, I think and I believe that both immigration and, dare I say it, gun control are issues that we have seen things happen really on both ends of the spectrum, and that there really is a lot of space for conversations in the middle. And that if we are going to pull ourselves out of some of the polarization, then we have to be able to have some of those conversations in the middle. And I'm gonna leave you guys, and we'll do some questions quickly with this article, and it's from Macomb County, Michigan, and it's in regards to I'll just pass them out, to the refugee executive order that was recently thrown out there, and then is now working its way through the court system. Just in case you guys aren't familiar, this was the piece where local jurisdictions, counties, and states would have to send a letter to the government stating their intent to welcome and receive refugees through the Refugee Resettlement Program. And so this conversation was really about, if your state said, great, we want to sign this letter to continue to welcome refugees, then every county and sometimes municipalities would also have to affirm their commitment to welcoming refugees. And as you see, what happened in Macomb County is that even the folks who were very supportive of welcoming refugees and very supportive of immigrants in general, frankly went back to relying on some really terrible rhetoric as far as their rationale and reasoning. And so my homework to you all is really to say, wow, take a look at this article, and how would you respond? How would you respond to what the county executive Mark Heckel says in this article, for instance? Because I think he really needs some reframing and some help from the supportive community that he has, and and how can we continue to do that as we go out and have these kinds of conversations with folks. So on that note, we have like 1 minute, and so I don't want to make anybody stay, so if there's like one question. Okay. Hey, thank you all. Sorry we got a little rush there at the end, but I really appreciate you sticking through here. I do have it. Yeah. Oh, good.
Veronica is passing them out. If you could please briefly complete those. And you can leave them on the table where the agendas were. Thank you.
Thanks again, everyone.
Actually, before you leave too, I want to point out that there's folks here in this room that are boots on the ground, working to create welcoming communities. Ross Wichnick's chair of the Human Services Commission, and there's many members here too. And also already left, but Tommy Parker, who's the chair of the Civil Rights Commission. So working collaboration is important, like you pointed out. We have not in our town here as well.
Yeah.
So there's many community partners that we're that we're already working in collaboration to make and